Hello and welcome back to the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. My name is Clay Wright, and it's good to be back here with you and also with Pastor Jason Russ. Pastor Jason, welcome back to the podcast.
What's up, Clay? It's good to be together. It's been a while. I apologize, everybody.
And I think this is actually our first podcast, just you and I.
Really?
I think it's our first one, just the two of us.
Oh, I think you are right.
Because
now
for
that
a
I think
while
about
we
it,
were doing those round tables with all the campus pastors when we would preach.
Mm-hmm.
But you did preach recently, a couple weeks ago, and you introduced us to Paul's missionary journeys as we're studying the Book of Acts. But then that week was so crazy. I think that was the week that you were in the Dominican Republic.
Right, I left pretty soon after, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so we weren't able to connect to record. But it's good to be here with you now.
You as well, buddy. Yeah.
So as we're studying Acts, we've sort of made a jump forward from the early parts of the book, which I guess we haven't really talked about this on the podcast. But if you look at the Book of Acts, it breaks down sort of into an emphasis on Jerusalem, Judea, and the ministry of Peter and the other apostles, but Peter sort of takes a primary spotlight. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, in the second half of the book, or after about chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, that frame, it starts to focus a lot more on the Apostle Paul, whose conversion, I think, happens in chapter 9. Mm-hmm. And so now we get into the late teens of the book, and we're looking at Paul's second missionary journey, which you started talking to us about 2 weeks back,
right?
With the man in Macedonia and all those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And now we come to Paul in Corinth, in the city of Corinth, which is, as you pointed out, it's the capital of Achaia, which is now I think it's interesting. There's so many names in the Book of Acts. Mm-hmm. There's all these names of all these cities, and then there's the regions that the cities are in.
Right.
And there's all these people, and they're names that are not super familiar to people. Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the things I loved about listening to your sermon was all the significance that you get when you actually pay attention to these things.
Right.
Like, for example, Sosthenes. He's the guy who takes the beating for Paul in this text. Mm-hmm. And if you could not pay attention and just think that that's a random guy that gets mentioned one time, and yet was it in the book? Which book does it reoccur in? Is it Philippians or was it in the Corinthians?
In Sosthenes' case, it was 1 Corinthians 1:1.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
He assisted in the writing of that letter.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Just nuts. And so this is one of the things that I've loved doing as I've studied Acts is checking in on the letters or the epistles that Paul wrote to the churches that we're reading about. Mm-hmm. And that clearly you did that as you were in your study, because you were able to pull lots of really great things out of these other letters that were relevant to where Paul's at in his journey.
Well, and that's a note to some of us that have study Bibles at home. This is why they have the maps in the back of the Bible. Yeah. So I highly recommend you get acquainted with them, because quite often you will get confused. And then just go to the back of your study Bible and see if there's any maps that'll help you. That really was significant for me with both messages. Yeah. The one from 2 weeks ago and then the one this past Sunday. The Lord showed me things by just pondering and looking at those maps that I like, for example, the 2 weeks ago, I would not have noticed that Lydia, being from Thyatira, I just didn't think about that. But then when I looked at the map, saw that Thyatira was in the very region where Paul was banging his head up against, closed doors. And I'm thinking, wow. I mean, come to think, God was sending him to a woman from that region saying, stop wasting your time here. I want you to go meet Lydia.
Yes.
And so the map helped me, you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's really a cool thing.
And so before we get too far into kind of exploring those texts in the Book of Acts, I did want to pause and just remember how it is that you began your sermon this week, which was with reference to our campus down in the Dominican Republic and Pastor Tito and his family. And I wondered, some folks listening in, obviously the point of this podcast is to pick up pieces that got cut out of the sermon. And I'm sure that you could spend hours and hours and hours talking about these recent trips that you've had to the DR. Mm-hmm. And you even said in your sermon that it was sort of like a Paul and Silas trip that you took with Hector Otero. It was Hector Otero, right?
Yep.
down to the DR.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you tell us, I mean, do you have any more stories that you would want to share in this time that, like, obviously you didn't have time to share on a Sunday morning?
Sure. Well, going back earlier in June, we had 2 trips go down that were arranged. One was for the Brisas sponsors. So we had 3 different Brisas sponsor families go down to meet their child and had a great time. That was a wonderful trip, about a 5-day trip. And then that was followed up by Joe and Ashley Gonzalez, and then a team going down of youth and some adults, and they ministered for a week down there. So that was wonderful, and those are unique and wonderful trips. We've done those kinds of things before.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the Brisas sponsor trip was one of a kind.
Really?
We broke ground on that one. We've never had a sponsor trip officially.
Interesting.
And so we're doing that again. That's going to be a routine every year. Every June we'll be planning a sponsor trip, and then next summer in June we'll follow that with a family missions trip, which we did last year, and then we'll alternate those, family, youth, every year. So anyway, those are different trips, but what Hector and I did was to try and break ground in a new way, to go down, support the leadership of the church, and give Tito and his family a break. What I've learned over the past few years, and just talking to and watching Tito, is one that he and his family minister as a family 7 days a week. I mean, they don't stop. They take breaks every now and then, but some of that is because that's just who they are. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, one of those things where I realize that if we don't actually get down there and make a statement to say, you're going on vacation and we're coming, that he might just change his plans again and just do a 2-day vacation or whatever. But at the same time, I think what the DR campus and Tito has needed for some time is to know that they're not just another missionary, because Tito is more than a missionary. He is a campus pastor. He is doing far more than many of us at our campus.
Yeah, I was about to say he probably runs circles around us.
Oh, he does.
What you're saying.
Yeah, he is every bit a pastor, and so we have to kind of go to great lengths, I think, to let him and the people of that church know that we are one.
Yeah.
And so that's what this summer's been, and I know my Lorraine people have felt the hit. My wife and children have felt the hit, even though my wife has been 100% behind what I've been doing this summer. But like I say, we're breaking some new ground in missions. Jonathan and I have been working with the Missions Council, and we're trying to get a rhythm and routine going. And this is one that will repeat, where every summer my prayer is that we'll have a staff member and someone they bring with them to go down and support the team down there so Tito can get away. And I believe it's got benefits going both ways. And one of the things I told them too was that I met with the leadership team, the deacons, both times I was down there this summer. And one of the things I told them was that you don't need our staff to come down here and do this for you. You can cover with all the gifts and resources you have. So let's make a deal. In January, when the students are out for school, you guys give Tito and Suhaili a week in January as well. And then they'll do that, and then we can come support you in the summer, and then Tito and Suhaili are getting 2 weeks a year that they can get away. So it was, I believe, in every way a success. So that's where I was so blessed to have Hector come with me, who's been slowly getting his feet wet in ministry at our church, doing different things, serving in many ways quietly. But God has a call on his life as a pastor. He was a pastor for years. And timing's everything. And I just felt when I was looking for a partner to go with me, he'd been on my mind, and I threw it out to him, and he immediately was like, yes, I'll go. I'm like, well, you might want to talk to your wife and maybe pray about it. He's like, I will. But I mean, right now I'm telling you yes. And man, one of the joys for me was sitting back really and kind of being in the background a little bit and letting Hector go, because he's bilingual. So he's just right in there chatting it up in Spanish and just ministering to the brothers and sisters. And he had a great word for the youth on Wednesday night when we had church. He shared his testimony on Sunday, ministering, out in the community and praying for people. And so it was very much a a shared ministry trip. It was awesome. So. And so yeah, we saw the Sue Haley and Tito at the beginning of the week and the end of the week.
Yeah.
They came back a little early because they had a little sickness issue hit them, so they came back early, which was too bad. But they still had a wonderful 5+ days away, and and it gave myself and Hector a chance to get to know each other really well, and then really get to know the leadership and the people, and and we, in every way, we were trying to fill Tito's shoes so that we could do as much as possible to make it, even the week he comes back, he has less people to visit, less outreach he needs to do. Mm-hmm. That was our goal. So we were going to visit people and praying for people. I went and showed, I wanted Hector to see the area where Brisas is, and we went over there and prayed over some places and people, and I took him up to a ministry place called the Lily of the Valley that Tito and Sue Haley have, that they have dreams of becoming a ministry location up in the agricultural area on the east of the city. And so he got to see that, and we we did lots of we did some ministry down in the park that was not expected, but we, God did some things. We're sitting around playing dominoes one night, and then I found out what a cultural phenomenon that is, and not just Dominican Republic, but across the islands. And they were telling me people are playing that every night, and there's massive fights, and people die from domino games because it's gambling and money and all this stuff. And so I'm like, really? I said, well, have you ever taken it down to the park, and just played some dominoes, but do it for Jesus, no money, take some coffee, whatever. And the guy in Mendoza, the kind of Tito's right hand's like, no, that's a good idea. I'm like, yeah, let's do that. Let's do that Thursday. He's like, okay. So he bought cookies, and we made coffee, and we took the tables down, and we even had our guitars and stuff. And so we set it up, and almost immediately a gentleman came over, sat right down at the table, started playing. And then before you knew it, another gentleman came over and sat down. And the second guy that came over had a little, bottle of whiskey or something on his lap, and you could tell he was a drinker. And come to find out, he was a nationally known boxer for the Dominican Republic. Shows us a video. I got a picture of him on the phone with him in the background, and a trainer. He became a trainer, but due to just different things in his life and family tragedy, he's like, my biggest thing is alcohol. That's his high place. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he's like, and as Hector and the guys lingered afterwards and talked with him, found out that he was suicidal. I'm just going to end it soon. The kind of thing. So the guys, told him, no, that's not the answer, and they prayed for him. And then what was wonderful was that when I got home, soon after we got home, we got a picture from Mendoza that he had followed up with that gentleman, and that he was at church on Sunday, this past Sunday. God. Yeah. Man. So now I think the guys are going to buy a couple more domino tables. And then I think the next time they have a group come down, they're going to go and set up at that. Imagine that, set up at the park, 2, 3, or 4 tables, have a little tournament, give away a prize at the end of the winner, but then have coffee and then give the gospel presentation at the end. Yes. And it was such a cool trial to see how it did, and it immediately bore fruit. So I'm excited for that. So that stuff like that happened where it was just that wasn't part of the plan. It just kind of happened organically from our discussions and being together. And I just love that about trips like that. So we had a lot of freedom. Hector and I didn't have a huge amount of things on our agenda, but we stayed busy and often had late nights talking and praying and, rested. But, at the same time, I was trying to work on this message and that was a challenge. But God was good to me because he really gave me a lot of material just in the conversations, in the times of prayer, as I was walking through the city, as we were visiting people. And lately that's been how the Lord's been feeding most of my messages, because it's just been, the pace has been crazy. But yeah.
Because I think the last time you preached, you had just gotten back from the Dominican Republic as well.
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah, the thing that stuck out to me from what you did share on Sunday about the DR is just how clearly you can see discipleship happening in Tito's ministry.
Yeah.
You know, he's calling these board members in, these deacons who are now he's equipping them, and now they're able to preach and to teach and to do all sorts of helpful things in his absence, but also in his presence. And so I was grateful for that. I was grateful for the ministry that you were able to do and discipling the folks that you brought, the folks that you were there with. And so it's super, super encouraging to, even last night we had a missionary visiting our life group who ministers in Turkey. And she's about my age, maybe a little bit older than me.
Yes.
And she's just sharing about what it's like to minister the gospel in that setting, you know. And so whenever we get an opportunity to hear what's going on in the church globally, I feel like it's such an enriching thing, because it helps us to knock off some of the narrow-mindedness that we can get into in the West. And that may be a high place of ours, which, like you said, we'll sort of get into talking about. But even as we sort of turn the corner now into talking about the content of your sermon, I love all these pictures that you're bringing to us from your time in Greece, in Italy. And so I wondered if you wanted to share any more background about that trip. People may not know what that's a reference to. Can you share more about your time in Greece?
Absolutely. August of 2023, Ginger and I were privileged to be able to join the trip with Pastor Jim and Andrea. And man, I had done Israel with other staff members. Ginger couldn't go with that one, but she really wanted to do Greece. And so God made a way for us both to be able to go, which was miraculous. And it was at the beginning of her chemotherapy. And now as we look back, Ginger's like, man, I wish we could go back again. Well, because she's feeling a lot better now, but she was feeling pretty rough when we were there. But we had such a wonderful time. And Jim and Andrea, Jim with his teaching and knowledge, and of course the people that he brings in, like our guide and that was with us. I'm blanking on her name right now, but Sophia, thank you.
Yeah, she's incredible,
amazing. And then Andrea, who has hospitality gifts through the roof, and her twin sister was there, who I've known for a long, long time, and her daughter-in-law, Andrea, and we just had the best time. And so for me, I wasn't as excited about walking in Paul's footsteps as I was Jesus's. I don't know if that's how you were, but I don't think I've given a lot of extra thought to Paul. But the Lord pricked my heart when we were ending the Israel trip and we were standing there at Caesarea. Am I saying the right town? As we're looking over
where he was in prison before he was sent off to Rome.
Yep, and we were standing there, and it was the last teaching of that trip. And that was the launching point, of course, where it's like, this is where the gospel would go out to Europe and to the world. And I was thinking to myself, well, that'll never happen. That's the next trip. I'm not going on that. Well, God made a way. And I think if there's one thing that I grew in appreciation of is who this man, Saul of Tarsus is, and how God transformed him and used him, and how beautifully he grew to become more and more like Jesus. That's our mission statement. And to see the heart of Christ in Paul is just stunning. I have a whole new appreciation. Like I said a couple weeks ago, kind of the theme of Paul's ministry that Jim started with on that tour was love goes out. So, the love of Christ went out from Jerusalem by effect through persecution, but that wasn't enough for Jesus. It just made it to Antioch, and that was it. And so God said, you know what? The Holy Spirit says, I'm going to tap Paul and Barnabas. I want them to go out, and I want them to take this word out. And so then it went from there. You know what I mean? Love goes out. And that's just how Paul lived his life.
And you think about what the world was like before the advent of Christianity, and I think that people don't sometimes we just don't recognize, we don't think about what did it mean for the gospel to go out into all the world? You know, what impact did it have? There's a book that's often referenced right now. I actually don't know. I've not read it, but it's by the guy who shares the name of Spider-Man. Tom Holland. It's by an author named Tom Holland, and I think it's a book that talks about the impact that Christianity has had on the West, just on the culture of the world, you know, as it made its way to Rome and then permeated the known world. What impact did that have on society, on culture?
Right.
And you know, in a world where we're fighting culture wars and like all this stuff is going on, sometimes it's interesting to go back and think, man, that the result of the ministry of the Apostle Paul on the world, carrying the message of Christ.
Because you see evidence in his journeys that the Torah and the Jewish faith had made its way west. You know, there were synagogues in some of those Greek towns. You know, not all, but in many of them there was a synagogue. So that's where he would go first. But then that was pretty exclusive, although there were many God-fearing Greeks, which meant that they were open to the God of the Torah, you know, the Yahweh, and they were seeking God, you know. But then you have this message of Christianity that comes through Paul's ministry and through word of mouth, really, because like I said Sunday, Christianity had reached Rome before Paul got there. And so the beauty of it is that Christianity was for all. You know, it was for Gentile and Jew, and the attractiveness of it, but then the transformational, the countercultural nature of it, of the place that men and women have, for example, that we are co-heirs, that Greeks and Jews both have, that it's not, you know, the insiders and outsiders, but we're all invited, you know, and just, it's so incredible. And I couldn't say enough, I mean, of going back to the trip to Greece, is how much I was blessed by the teaching, by that journey. It's like when I preached on 2 weeks ago and then this one, I felt like I had so much I was already enriched and ready and to go to begin to pray through the sermon, but it benefited me so much. I probably I couldn't reference enough how blessed I was by being on that.
Well, and I think for me, one of my favorite things about having been to these locations is it just grounds it for you. Like you recognize this is not just a story. This is a play. This is an account of a place that Paul went and things that he did. And it matches up with the ancient history of Corinth. And so you know, because you can, you know, in your sermon, you talked about these 4 different places: the high place, the low place, no place, which was hilarious, and then the place of judgment. Yeah. And if you look back at the text, nowhere in the text does it talk about, quote unquote, like a high place. Right. And yet it's so clearly evident in there that it's, you know, this was such a huge phenomenon in Corinth. You know, this is one of the reasons why we study Scripture and why we do this historical work, is because there's so much more going on at times. It's you know, people in the first century reading this, they would have had all this knowledge already baked in. Oh, Corinth. Oh, yeah, they've got Acrocorinth. They've got this, you know, of course, you know, the Greek cities have these high places. It was the air that they breathe, and it's not the air that we breathe. And so it's so helpful to be able to think some of their thoughts after them, to remember, okay, there's these cultural things, these even, you know, the change in elevation and all these sorts of things had an impact on that culture, and it matters.
Well, and I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to preach on this text, was because I was so impacted by witnessing and seeing the Acrocorinth. You know, I wish we could have gone up there, but maybe
you guys didn't go up.
We didn't go up. Did you?
Oh yeah.
Oh man, we didn't have time.
I've got pictures from Acrocorinth looking out over the
oh, jealous. Jealous.
It's beautiful, and there's like this old, like broken down fortress.
Right. It's right from the Ottoman period. Yeah. Yeah. But I wish we could have gone up there. But yeah, the benefit for me was like just seeing how the contrast between that Acropolis and the one in Athens, and to think how much of an impact it had on the people there. And Sophia was the one that mentioned all those thoughts about like the 1,000-year reign of that sexual immorality and that way of pagan worship and the child slavery and all that. And that struck a chord with me because I not too long ago had watched that movie, The Sound of Freedom.
Yes.
And so, I watched that on the way to Indonesia, and I'm weeping in my seat, somewhere between, U.S. and Jakarta, and it was just like so impacting. But to think, do we cry for other times in history, like a 1,000-year period where poor kids were given up as slaves to a temple where they were then unspeakable acts were done on them, and we think we're getting better, as mankind. We're hopelessly lost. We need a savior. We need salvation, and that's why I think context matters, history matters, and that's one of the reasons I picked the text, was because I was so impacted by the prominence of that high place in Corinth, and all it made me think about for me is what's my high place? What is in my view that is competing with Christ?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's really the question that I wanted to spend some time with as we're kind of thinking back over this text and thinking about this point that you made out of that understanding of Corinth and what was going on there. And the question the way I wanted to phrase it was, if the Apostle Paul was coming to Cleveland or he was coming to America, and imagine he could sort of look at all of our culture all at once, sort of like it was in one city. What would he notice? What would he identify as some of the high places in our culture? And maybe even we can talk about it in our culture in general, but even specifically in Christian culture in the West, or Christian culture in America. What are some of those high places that you've noticed for people?
I mean, some of them are obvious. I mean, the very first one I would think of that's easily seen is the high place of just myself. Putting me on that throne, which, I mean, that's in Scripture. Nebuchadnezzar builds the big idol of himself and tells Daniel and the boys to drop and bow down. And that's just, I think, our nature is we don't like to admit it, but we love to worship ourselves, whether we see it or not. And so then I think the other thing is, a big battle today, and I think I mentioned it in the text or in the message, is technology. I had one person come up to me after the first service and say, up on that hill is my phone, is my addiction to being on the phone, and we talked, a little bit about how do we take that down, and so I think technology, our addiction to distraction, which again was part of my text of a couple weeks ago, is that we can be so distracted that because we're so entertained. So entertainment, I mean, just binge watching and just mindless, viewing of different things can become really dangerous, because then, are we redeeming the time? What's happening? So I think me being entertained and me being, again, it comes back to me, me being on the throne. I think sex is a big one. I mean, that struck a chord, I think, with people. And that, of course, goes back to technology because it's so accessible. So the high place is easily made, our own sexual addictions. And I didn't mention this, but I mean, I could have even said that, any sexual immorality encompasses all of it. Yep. So even my sexual identity, and I believe that's a huge high place for many people. Yeah. And people don't want to talk about that and don't want to talk about it that way and go into the whole weeds of saying, well, it's just the way I've been made forever, and this is how God made me. Well, you can, I don't know, bring God into that if you want, or you can understand what Scripture says, and that says that we're sinners from conception, and therefore every thought I have is against my Creator. So we have to go back to God's Word and say, what does He say is right and true and holy, and what does He want? Now, what do I want? Too many people today have their sexual urges and their sexual desires on the high place, and it is replacing God and God's voice in their life. And I'm not afraid to say that. Yeah. So that's another one. And then I think we have politicians, we have people, we have preachers that we revere more highly than we do even the Word of God. I thought of this in our devotions, and I got to share this just because I thought it was so fascinating. But I never thought of this in a political sense. But Jesus said this in John 5 when he's talking to the Pharisees. He says, "I've come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you'll accept him. How can you believe, since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God?" And when I thought of that, I thought of this political season we're coming up on. Yeah. And many people are glorifying people, men, women, and yet they've rejected the glory that comes from the one and only Son, who's here to reveal the Father. We got to get first things first. We got to get Jesus on the high place alone before I think we can even see straight to know who and what we should do with politics and all that. So I think politics is a big high place. So have I struck enough chords? And
well, I mean, yeah, that's good. I'm just listening and just totally agreeing with you. And I'm finding myself thinking, it's just so interesting to me that even though we don't have a literal high place, and we don't, if someone came up to me and they were like, "Hey, let's go build a temple to, let's build a temple to sex, or let's build a temple to these politicians, or let's build a temple to these things," I would be like, "That's ridiculous. Get out of here." And yet this whole idea of the high place, it communicates so deeply to me and to many. And I think that's one of the things that, like, it seemed like everybody in my life group, when we were talking about this sermon, resonated with this idea, because there's something about the human spirit, there's something about the human heart, where there's this throne, there's this seat, and we put something on there, and so much of what you're talking about, whether it's, quote unquote myself, or like self-actualization, just becoming the best me that I can, seeking pleasure, seeking security, like even I think a lot of the politicians and sort of the idolizing of people, I think a lot of that can be, well, it's going to help me socially advance because I'm going to be on the good guys team, right? Or it's helping me helping make me feel secure because someone who I admire agrees with me, or it's like something along those lines. But really, I think so much of it, the buck stops with me and my sense of safety, my sense of pleasure, my sense of all these things. And what's crazy to me is that you have that on the one hand that I think is totally true, that in America and in the West, it's king me. I truthfully, at the end of the day, as long as I'm happy, as long as I'm comfortable, as long as I feel good, as long as I have access to these endorphins and I can get them sort of whenever I want and I can get them quickly, that's what people are chasing after. Yeah. And they're using all these different means to do it. And then on the other hand, you have this idea that you talked about in your sermon where people have an opportunity to choose persecution in the West. Yeah. Like just the contrast there that we so often default to and run after and chase after pleasure and safety and all these sorts of things. Yeah. And yet Paul chooses to keep going in a culture, and after he's been beaten and mocked and scorned. Yeah. And then ultimately Sosthenes gets the beating for him. But these quotes from the Insanity of God that you were pulling out, that we have no less of an opportunity or no less of a choice to preach the gospel in any context. It's totally our choice. It's just some of the choices come with different consequences. Right. And so it's like we can choose discomfort, we can choose pain, we can choose difficulty by preaching Christ and by really chasing after him. Or we can default into this high place of the culture and choose pleasure and all these other things. And it's like, why? If we're honest, so many of us are choosing this over here. Well, and the point that's made in that book is that when we're silent, we side with the enemy. Yeah. We side with those who are the persecutors. And the author quoted one other
man who was a interviewee who had been persecuted for his faith, spent time in prison, and he said to the author, he said, "Don't you in freedom give up? Don't give up in freedom what we have paid for in prison and through death.
Yes.
And don't give up the privilege you have to share your faith, to be a light. Don't give that up in freedom when we have done that and we haven't given it up through persecution and through prison and death." And I'm like, man, that's so convicting. We give it up and we think, well, my faith's private. Well, when your faith's private and you don't share it with anybody, then you're simply acting like the persecutors of the persecuted church, because that's what they do. They're silent about their stance on Christ, or worse. So you can't be implicit in that. You've got to be a light. You've got to be out there. And I think that's one thing I really learned from Paul, is just his tenacity to go. And yet in this case, for once, the word of the Lord came through for him, and his prayer, and he didn't do anything. He didn't have to defend himself. He didn't have to. He didn't get the beating. And it's just, it was a very different, unique experience from everything that's happened up to that point.
Right.
Because he's usually either running away, or he's getting a beating. But this is a unique text in what happened here.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess another question I wanted to ask, sort of along these lines, is given the fact that, if we're honest, most of us are at best a mixed bag when it comes to what really has our allegiance, our loyalty, what's on the high place of our heart. Mm-hmm. Which this is in Athens, they had multiple temples up on the Acropolis. The biggest one was to Athena, but they had a temple to Zeus. They had anyhow. So you
Poseidon, I think, was the other one up there.
Yeah. And so there was clearly a front runner for them, but we're sort of like that, I think, at times, where we have these things competing for that place in our life. So just as you minister to folks who have that conflicted allegiance, how can we? What do we do when we recognize this in our lives? What do we do when we recognize, man, that thing has slowly creeped in, or it's actually taken over the high place in my life?
Well, I think we've got to be humble. We've got to be willing to see that we have not got it all figured out, and there are competing things. And that's a little discouraging at times, because you feel like, I should have this all figured out by now, depending on how long you've been a Christian or how long you've been at it. But the truth of the matter is that when Jesus becomes our Savior and Lord, Savior immediately, that happens, boom. But for us to learn what it means to be under a master and to be under a new master, that's a lifelong process.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't get replaced. And there might be some. I know some people that they're alcoholics, and then the minute they trusted Christ, they never touch a drink. And then I know others that struggled, over the years and have been in and out of rehab, and yet they are 100% believers, right? Yeah. I think everybody's different in that regard, but in God's grace and plan is different for every person. So I think we're going to have that struggle. And I think that the Lord allows that strain and that struggle for us so that we depend on him. Like, we have to depend on him like crazy. And so I think my encouragement for folks is to understand that it is a process. That whole becoming like Christ is not a night and day, boom, all of a sudden I've figured it out because I believed. No, it's a journey. That's why we call it open door and adventure, because it's going to have highs, it's going to have deep lows, but you got to keep going on that journey. And I think of the fact that a good example of this biblically is the fact that even when we have the Holy Spirit, there's going to be struggle and strain, because there's certain things that are ingrained in us. For example, Paul had to call Peter out in the book of Acts. I can't remember where Paul wrote about it. Ephesians, maybe? He writes about having to confront Peter. Mm-hmm. And I may have that wrong. It's one of his letters.
It could be Galatians. I think,
yeah. So one of the letters he describes confronting Peter. And Peter was clearly in the wrong. He was clearly affected by the fact that the Jewish leaders, brothers from Jerusalem showed up. So now he's self-conscious about sitting with the Gentiles, which was fine. And so then he denies the truth of the gospel by moving to another table. Mm-hmm. Paul calls him out. And clearly Peter had the Spirit of God for quite some time at that point. Shouldn't he be, righteous and perfect and doing everything right?
He's the rock.
Right. Yeah. But he is still got that ingrained sense of, shame and fear that can at times overtake us and get our eyes off of Jesus. So in that moment, I think Peter got his eyes on the winds and the wave again. When those people walked in the room, his eyes were on the winds and the waves, not on Jesus. And so he began to sink. And Paul called him back, And so I think that's a really good description of our high places, is we get our eyes off of Jesus and we allow those things to creep up into prominence on the high place. And Jesus is saying, no, you have little faith. Tear those things down. Keep your eyes on me. They're gonna call for you. They're gonna howl and blow at you and try to knock you over, but don't listen to that noise. Don't pay attention. Just keep your eyes on me. And I think that's why Satan's keeping all of us so distracted. Because if he can keep us distracted, then we're not even thinking about what's the high place in our life. Who cares? We're just kind of going in this half attention all the way to the grave. And Satan is just a master at keeping our eyes off of him, So I think what Christ is calling all of us to is this deep intimacy that's 24/7, nonstop, that is in the midst of living. Jesus is absolutely Lord. I've given my entire life to him, my soul, mind, and body, and that's everything I am. Yeah. And so therefore, there is no other room in my life for anything else. And that is a training thing. That's discipleship. That takes discipleship. That takes training yourself. That takes beating your body, like Paul said, taking every captive subject to Christ. He had to do that. So anyway, that's just a few thoughts.
Yeah, no, I told, and really, it's reminding me of that quote that you ended with from Brother Lawrence. It's this process of learning to love God entirely.
Yeah.
And he talks about that process. He's like, well, how are you going to love God if you don't know him?
Right.
How are you going to know him if you don't think about him often? And then he sort of makes this turn, and he's like, well, but what you'll find, and what's so interesting, is that when you come to know him, when you really come to love him, you'll find that you think of him often anyway. So he's basically saying, if you really want to love God, you need to think about him often. Like, you need to pursue him, give your attention to him, turn to him. And then what you'll find is that once you love him, you'll be doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But it'll be the love that sustains the pursuit of God rather than the pursuit of God that produces the love. So it's like this cycle. It's like this fire that stokes itself.
Yeah.
And that's what I want more of for myself, and that's what I want more of for our church as well.
Amen. Yeah.
But, we're coming close to kind of the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask, is there anything else that you wanted to share from your study or from the sermon, or any final thoughts with folks?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed this whole text and looking at Paul's life. Really, really challenged me. I think what I'd like to say is that there's hope. There's tremendous hope, because when it comes to what Christ has done for us, and this is another line I was thinking of going on the sermon, but I maybe it's better I saved it for the podcast. But when you think about Jesus and you think about what I talked about in the sermon, Jesus came to us from a high place. He was at the right hand of the Father, and he was up in heaven, and he didn't have to do a thing. And yet, when the Father said, "Who will go?" Jesus basically said, "Here am I, send me, I'll go." And then he came down to a low place, John chapter 1.
Yeah.
He made himself nothing, as Paul said in Philippians, and took on the form of a servant, humbling himself, coming to a low place. And he literally came to a place that was a dead end. I mean, why would he even bother? We're not just talking Sin City, we're talking Sin Planet. Why would he even bother coming here?
Yeah.
And yet his love was so great that even in the face of a dead end, where there's no place to go with these people, no place to go with their sin, he doesn't just make judgments from afar. He immerses himself into the culture of a sinful world and shines like a star. Here he is in the no place. He's in the low place. And then he is there, as he said, John 3:16 and 17, Son of Man did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. So he's literally the walking, breathing judgment place of God, and yet he chooses to not judge man, but loves them instead. The whole time he's in his ministry, the whole time he's there, all 33 or so years he's walking the earth, he is there to teach people and to show people and to say, hey, there is a judgment place. Let me tell you the story about the sheep and goats. Let me tell you a story about, someday when you're going to have to give an account to your master for the talents that you've been given.
Yes.
And so he gives all these great teachings that are speaking of the judgment place someday. But then ultimately what Jesus does then is he offers himself up at the judgment place of man at the hands of the Jewish leaders, and then lays his life down at that judgment place willingly to die in our place, saying to the whole world, I will take your place on that judgment day. What are you talking about? Right? And that's the gospel. So like even in the, if I could have summarized it that way, if I had, enough time, but I mean, that is what Christ has done for us. He's hit all the places for us so that we can hear him say, I'm going away to make a place for you. In my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm making a place for you. So he gives us that wonderful invitation that where I will be, that you may be also. But that starts now. So I think, there's a place in each of our hearts that we got to wrestle with, that Christ wants to rule and reign in our hearts. He wants to live in us. But it's the high place that calls us, that owns us. What owns you? And, I've just been fascinated by the fact that even in the Old Testament, the high places were the big Achilles heel of the Israelites. But I think it's still our Achilles heel today. And so Jesus is calling us, and he showed us how. He had one high place, and that was the Father. And he demonstrated that so beautifully. I want that for us. I want that for me. Yes. To have that kind of communion with Jesus, to know the Father and to know him that, man, our devotions today, the Spirit brings life. The words of Jesus are spirit and life. And we miss that so easily. We need to attach ourselves to his word. Everything he said, everything he did, and those words are going to bring spirit and life. And I know, I pray that they will for my guy that was the boxer that we met, that he will find spirit and life, and that high place of alcohol will be torn down in his life. And, literally his life saved, I think, from God crossing our paths last Thursday. Yeah. And so who does God have for you to cross paths with this week? That, to me, that's the best kind of living, is that kind of living, because we really don't get anywhere when anything else but Christ is on the high place. So, yeah, that's my thoughts, buddy.
And I love that you bring up the words of Christ there, because in my copy of the New Testament and the book of Acts here, it's got that vision that Paul has in Corinth in red letters.
Nice.
The words of Jesus. They put it as though it's the words of Jesus.
Nice.
To Paul, and that to me was my big takeaway from this text, is this idea that when we're discouraged on the journey, or when we're feeling like we're getting no place, to remember that Jesus is calling us forward.
Yeah.
And that he's with us in the midst of that, even in times where I'm sure Paul, why does Jesus tell Paul that Jesus is with him? Well, it's probably because Paul didn't sense that. It's probably because Paul wasn't thinking, well, but at least I got Jesus here with me. It's probably because he was in despair.
Absolutely.
Maybe he was thinking back to that previous vision about the man in Macedonia, and he's wondering, man, did I get it wrong? Should I have stayed in Asia? Should I have tried harder? Should I have gone a different way? And so it's just like the grace of God to send him this second vision and to say, don't give up, keep going, I'm with you. Yeah. And that's such an encouragement to me as I'm on this journey of struggling and pursuing and learning to love God more and more deeply. And I hope that's encouragement to everybody else as well.
Amen.
Jason, thank you for your study, for your time in the Word, for bringing it to us, and for blessing us with just this time to hear more from your heart and to dig into the Scriptures a little bit more.
It's been my joy and pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, buddy.
And thank you to you all as well who have been able to stick it through right up to the end of the podcast. Man, we appreciate you guys. We do this as a labor of love for you. Jason and I and the rest of the folks that we have on, we love having these conversations, but really we hope that it's a labor of love to you all. And so if you're enjoying this or if you're being ministered to by this content, let us know by leaving a like or subscribing or doing all those things on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're accessing this content. Leave us a little review or a rating or whatever it would be to let us know that God is using this in your life to encourage you, to help you on your adventure of becoming more like Christ. And we'll look forward to coming at you with a new episode soon. And until then, we will see you next week. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. But don't let the conversation end here. Find a group where you can deepen your roots at connect.opendoor.tv. And don't forget to submit your questions to podcast@opendoor.tv. Have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.